Hi, this is Carrie, and welcome to the 6th video in this series that is looking at the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet and how it's revealing Jesus Christ. In today's video, we're going to talk about, it's kind of a continuation of the last video in a way of it's building on each other. In the last video, we talked about how Christ is teaching us to live by His indwelling life. And He's doing that for a reason. And today, this letter that we've been looking at declares that reason. And I want to start with looking at each individual letter that makes up this letter first. So we know from the past videos that I've done that the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is made from the 7th letter and the 6th letter put together. But I want to talk about them individually to show you where I'm going with what Christ is after. So the 7th letter, this is what it looks like when it's not connected to anything. And you can see here, there's only a few letters in the Hebrew alphabet that actually have these, what they call the crowned things on top. And obviously 7 has that. This is the representation of Christ. But it also has some meanings here where it says, you know, Him being Christ is the crowned man who wields the sword of the Spirit. And this is important as we take a look at where I'm headed today. The second letter that uses to make up the 8th letter of the alphabet is 6. Vav, okay? And so we have known Vav to represent man or many men. But it also represents, if you can see here, the way this looks, it is a peg with a little hook here, okay? And the way they have always seen this is that these represented the pegs or the poles with the hooks that were required to, you know, assemble the temple in the past, where they would hang the silver rings right here and then connect the curtains onto each of the poles all the way around, assembling the temple wherever it needed to move. And so as we can see here, if this is representing the idea that this is the materials for the temple, well, we also have man here. It also represents man. So the full thought of this letter is that man is the building materials of God's new temple. And that's what I want to talk about today. When we see these two put together, 7 and 6, we obviously get 8. And what this actually shows us is that Christ in man equals the spiritual house of God. And what this brought me to think about was Nehemiah. And in the time when the temple was being rebuilt, there was a decree sent out that they could return to their home if they wanted to. They were allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple, but only a few actually came back. I think they call it a remnant, or maybe 2% or whatever, but there weren't as many that had actually left and that were exiled to Babylon. Only a few actually came back to rebuild. But as they were rebuilding, they had issues with rebuilding. They encountered problems with people trying to impede their process, but also they had to fight for this building to be built. And you see in Nehemiah where they talk about the fact that they had a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other. One so they can build, and one so that they could fend off whatever attacks were happening so that they could continue to build. And really, when I take a look at this, you can see that Christ is the one who's wielding the sword. He's the one that is holding the sword in his hand, fending off the attacks, fending off all the issues that are impeding him from building his new temple. And we are actually the building materials he is using to build. And so I want to read here this verse in Nehemiah 4:17 through 18. Those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried the burdens took their loads with one hand doing the work and the other holding a weapon. As for the builders, each wore a sword girded at their side, while the trumpeter stood near me. So they needed to continue to build, but they also needed the sword in order to make sure that the temple could be continued to be built without interference. Just to kind of bring about the idea that man is actually today the fulfillment of the temple man is actually the building temple. I keep saying that. The actual building materials God is using. I want to go back to Jacob. So remember in our story with Jacob, when the ladder came down and he had saw the heavens open up and he saw the ladder. The next day he declared that place Bethel, and he poured oil on this stone, right? And that's his dedication of that place. That is the fulfillment of the day of Pentecost. So the day of Pentecost, the Spirit was given to the people of God. And so the Spirit is also known as the oil. And so the Spirit in the form of oil was poured out onto these dead stones and were made living. And they became Bethel, the house of God. Now, this is God turning the people into his building materials for his new temple. And we know in the past, whenever God was, the people had, finished either the temple or the tabernacle or whatever version they were building at the time, he would dedicate that temple with fire coming down out of heaven. And so it would dedicate it, but it would also give them the knowledge that he had actually filled his presence with that in the temple. And that's what also happened on the day of Pentecost. All of that in the past, whenever he did that with the temples and tabernacles in the past, was just a foreshadowing of the final temple that would be dedicated. And so the day of Pentecost, when the fire came down out of heaven, he was actually dedicating people as his new temple, but he was also filling them with his presence, like literally inhabiting and indwelling them. So this declared to all around that they were the actual new temple of God. So now that day, the people became the building materials for the final and new temple of God. And that this temple that Christ is building for his Father, he is using these living stones now to bring them together and to be fitted together to become that final temple that we see in Revelations. And this is the temple that is not built with human hands. It is built by Christ himself. We do remember that, just like in the past, there was only a remnant of people that came back to actually help build or rebuild the temple. It is like that today. There is only a remnant of people who are actually making themselves available as building materials to God to be built as the temple of God. So that he may have his resting place, his new resting place on earth. And this is echoed by Peter as well, not necessarily the remnant part, but the part that we are the living stones being made into something. We read 1 Peter 2:5 where he says, you also are living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. So this is a spiritual building that is happening. And things in the spirit are not able to be seen like the things in the physical. So anyway, so you also, as living stones, being made living stones, are being built up into a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Paul even talks about this too in 1 Corinthians 3:9 in a way of that we are God's building, or that we're the building materials. He says, for we are God's fellow workers, but you are God's field and God's building. And in Revelations 3:12, it does talk about in that very first sentence, says, the one who is victorious, I will make them a pillar in the temple of my God. Which you kind of get here being, a peg, a pole, a pillar, and things like that. It's just echoing that as what will happen. In 1 Timothy 3:15, it also says, God's house, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth. So we can see here that God's intention was always for man to be his building materials, to be built together into this spiritual house where he can rest and he can have his say about things, where he can have his authority exercised, where he can do what he wants, when he wants, however he wants it done. And that we have been put together with Christ, who is helping this building to happen. So we can see that Christ and the church, they are working together to build God's house. So just to review, we can see that Christ and the church are working together to build this spiritual house for God. and that Christ is holding the sword in his one hand, protecting the building site. And she, on the other hand, and her part in this, is allowing herself to be that living stone, to be shaped and prepared to be built as the temple of God. And that one day she will come down out of heaven, adorned and ready to be presented as this new glorious temple. This temple, that where the actual building site happens, is in the ecclesia. It is the habitat through which this spiritual temple will be built. The ecclesia is where the living stones are brought together, they are shaped, they are molded, they are polished into this final product, and then fitted together into this spiritual house that God is building. And so we need each other, and Christ needs us in order to build, this house for his Father. It is a wonderful thing that we've been called into. This is a high calling that the Lord has asked us to enter into, to become the building materials that allow themselves to be fitted together to be God's temple. In my last video, the next video that's coming up, it will be the last one that wraps all of this up in one verse, and it will show how all of these things are linked together and how they work together for God's eternal purpose, for him to get what he's always been after. Hope you enjoy. Have a good day.